Well, joining me now is Tim Ripley, weapons analyst at Jane's and author of the book Little Green Men, The Inside Story of Russia's Military Power. Good evening to you, Tim.
Good evening.
Is this a play by Russia? Can you believe that Russia are booby-trapping the city of Kherson as they retreat and as, of course, the troops from the native country move in to try and reclaim their land again?
It's perfectly plausible. It seems that's an obvious thing to do from their point of view. They are not being driven out of the city. They're retreating. Their troops are falling back. They're pulling back over the Dnieper River. They are moving into positions on the eastern bank, ready to defend against the next phase of the Russian offensive. Now, obviously they are trying to cause as much delay, as much casualties to the Ukrainians as possible. So they're going to they've planted huge minefields, they've booby-trapped roads, they've blown up bridges, they've sabotaged their electricity, and all that, the kind of thing they would do to try and delay the Ukrainian advance and make it as difficult as possible for them to follow up on their retreat.
I suppose in terms of weaponry and artillery, is it worth Russia doing that? I suppose is it worth their while? Is that more about saving face for Vladimir Putin?
Well, the Russians are now are moving into a defensive phase, and their main objective is to avoid losses to their troops, because they took heavy losses in the start of the war, and they're trying to preserve their forces ready for a new offensive elsewhere in Russia. And defending Kherson from the western bank, where the terrain's really open and it's really easy for the Ukrainians to attack, from the Russian perspective, will mean they'll suffer loads of casualties. Whereas if they retreat over the river, and this is not just any young river, this is a river that's a kilometre wide. So it's not something where you can easily do a river assault with in boats. This is a major obstacle, and it'd be really difficult for the Ukrainians to attack across it. So they're going to pull back, save their troops, and dig in along the riverbank and just wait for the Ukrainians to try and attack and inflict, quite heavy losses on them if they try and cross. And they're going to pull back their troops, and these are some of their best troops, their airborne division, and use that elsewhere in the front, in the Donbass or anywhere else on the Ukrainian-Russian border, for a new offensive in a terrain that's better suited to the Russians, because they are definitely going to go for a long war strategy. They're attacking all the electricity grids. They're making the Ukrainians suffer during the winter, and they're preparing for a new offensive somewhere else, which try and take the Ukrainians by surprise and attack them where their defenses are weaker, and see how it rolls from there.
What has surprised you most about the last few months of this war?
Really, it's the intensity of it. I mean, in the summer, when they were fighting in the Donbass, there were reports of firing 50,000 artillery shells a day and 200 Ukrainian soldiers being killed a day. That is a level of casualties that we haven't seen since World War II. And only today, the chief of the US General Staff said the Russians and Ukrainians, between them, have lost 200,000 casualties since February. He said about 100,000 Russians and 100,000 Ukrainians have been killed or injured in this war. That is of a scale of intensity of war that we haven't seen in Europe since World War II. It's a part of the Iraq-Iran war, but apart from that, this is the most intense war since World War II. It's on a scale that is the destruction and the casualties they're off the scale.
Is this war still sustainable for both sides, do you think, Tim?
Well, that when you say sustainable, I mean, Russia is a country with a population of 150 million, 160 million people. Ukraine is 44 million people, of which 40 million are still in the country, 20 million men able to participate in the fighting. So yes, it just depends on whether both sides are willing to take the losses. It's a war. It's almost a war of wills now, war of willpower. Who can keep fighting the longest? It's not a case of who's got the most guns and shells and whatever, because they've all got loads of that. It's who can keep fighting and keep taking that level of losses.
Some of the overarching assessment is that Russia is not the military power we might have thought them to be. What was your analysis at the start of the war on that front? You're perhaps much better informed than the rest of us,
Well,
but
well,
go on.
well, on paper, Russia is a big military power. It's got nuclear weapons. It's got thousands of fighter planes. It's got nuclear bombers. It's got all the stuff that you ascribe to a major power. But it probably only had 800,000 personnel in its armed forces, of which 300,000 were soldiers. Now, if you think the British Army's 77,000, the German Army's 80,000, the French Army's 90,000. So they don't have that overwhelming supremacy that they used to have in the Cold War, where the Red Army is 5 million men. So they embarked on this war on a false premise that they could win it easily, and they didn't. And that it's catching up with them. They haven't got enough troops. They certainly didn't have at the start of the war to prosecute it for a sustained period. I mean, they've now had this mobilization. They've recruited 300,000 former reservists back into the army, and they're setting themselves up for a sustained long war, which, as we've seen so far, is going to be bloody, and lots of people, tens of thousands of more people are going to die, and that's the reality of this.
Yeah.
It goes on at this level of intensity.
Well, it's really nice to speak to you. Thank you so much for bringing
Well, it's not
us.
really nice, but
Yes, exactly. Well, I was about to say thank you for bringing us your analysis. It's always good to hear expertise, but you're right about it not being nice. It's nice on a personal level to speak to you.
Thank you.
Listen, thanks so much, Tim Ripley, weapons analyst at Janes and author of the book Little Green Men, the inside story of Russia's military power. This is Kate Borsay with you on the evening edition on Times Radio. When we come back after the news, we'll be discussing a special Remembrance Day poem written by the brilliant poet Nikita Gill. We'll be here